Now, we have titled this overall series Innovations in Surgery, and today's presentation really is all about that. And we're going to be focusing on innovating in surgery, and we're going to talk about the top 10 innovations in surgery. And our two presenters are Dr. Lee Swanstrom and Toby Gordon, and I'll introduce Toby in a second. I know that Lee needs no introduction to this audience. He's currently at the Oregon Clinic half his time, and the other half as the Chief Innovation Officer at the IHU at the University of Strasbourg. Lee has a very long history of being visionary and as an innovator, and I have to point out that this morning he has answered the call far above and beyond the call. We thought initially that he was going to be in France for this presentation, which would be a very comfortable midday presentation. As it turns out, we got the math wrong, and he's in Portland, Oregon, so it's about 3 in the morning for Lee. So, Lee, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great, Adrian. Thanks a lot, and good morning to everybody. It is bright and early. I've have my product placement here, so. But it's great. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to present at the Innovations in Surgery series. It's amazing how much it's grown and progressed, although this is the reason why there's no West Coast medical centers on the program. So Adrian asked me to address kind of innovations in surgery as a topical thing. I think initially we thought that we would just show you some cool technology that's out there, but there's so much that's out there. It was turned out to be just impossible to list 10 devices or trends in even device development and have it not forget or not eliminate some other ones. So in conjunction with Toby Gordon, who's a business expert and who you'll meet later, we're going to tag team and talk a little bit about some of the issues that are going on in innovations in surgery. I think this is a very keen topic right now because there's a lot of kind of clouds on the horizon, if you will, for innovation. And I think innovation for surgery surgeons is a very key and important topic. So this will be kind of a topical thing, and hopefully it'll stimulate some give and take and questions with that, if you will. And this is partly, I gave a talk at, the next slide. Let me advance the slide there. Yeah, perfect. I gave a talk at SAGES just a couple weeks ago and kind of listed that. And of course, you have to have a disclosure slide. And this is kind of my disclosure slide. And I put this up here just to say that I've always, throughout my career, been involved in technology assessment and working with companies, and particularly small companies, but larger companies as well, to look at new technology and try to figure out how it would fit into the healthcare system. So this is something I enjoy, and it's something I find very challenging and interesting. So that's kind of my background, is approaching this both from a surgeon standpoint and as a system standpoint, and particularly in looking at startup companies. So we'll discuss that to some extent as well. So we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to kind of tag team this, and talks kind of divided into 3 parts. One is to discuss how innovation's involved in surgery, and then Toby Gordon's going to join us and talk about the business of surgical innovation, and I'll let her introduce that part, and then we'll come back to me and kind of finish up with hopefully a very interactive dialogue on the current and future state of surgical innovation, because it's in a real state of flux right now. Innovation's obviously something that's involved in all human endeavors. I think a lot of it, we think of creativeness in the arts and the fine arts as well, and really for us, innovation in the sciences and in medicine in particular is the equivalent of groundbreaking fine arts creativeness, if you will. So this is a common human endeavor and a mental attitude, if you will, that goes through all human activities. But in science, we think of it as innovation. Next. And I think a key definition when we think of innovation is this one, where creativity is kind of a mental effort, thinking up new things, and all surgeons do that when you're in the operating room. Think, wouldn't this be a cool new gadget? Wouldn't this be we should do this differently? But really the difference between the innovator and a creative surgeon is the innovator actually does something. So he thinks of a new idea and then he implements it and goes to the laboratory or works or talks to a company and actually makes something happen. And so I think that's really the key, that think of something new and then to implement that and work on it. So when we talk about innovation, for the purposes of this talk anyway, that's what we're talking about. So this is taken from Dave Ratner's talk, presidential address at SAGES in 2006, which I think was just a fascinating and great talk. And as you can see, he got this, derived this from well-known business practices as well. And this divides innovation into two forms, two very distinct approaches. One's incremental innovation, the other one's disruptive innovation. Incremental innovation, of course, is something that is just an improvement on current existing practices, improvement on a current existing device, going from a single clip applier to a multiple clip applier, etc. And really is not too hard to understand or implement or bring into the hospital. Usually it makes it quicker, easier, or cheaper, if you will. I think what we really as surgeons look for is disruptive innovation, and this is both an opportunity and a potential liability for surgeons. So what do we mean by disruptive innovation? And I bring this graph to you, and this is just one example, and this is derived from one of Dave's talks as well. And this shows that there's a narrow band of acceptability within our medical system of new technologies or new procedures. And very quickly we evolve outside of that bounds. Either things become too traumatic for patients or too expensive for the healthcare system. And then disruptive innovation happens. And this can be radical change, and it forces it back down into a band of acceptability. And I used heart valves as an example on this, where open cardiac surgery, of course, is the standard of care. Patients got used to thinking about minimally invasive approaches for other surgeries, and of course mid-cabs and other ways of doing minimally invasive cardiac valves came along, and it bumped. Most cardiac programs had to adapt to that, had to jettison, if you will, the standard approaches and radically reinvent themselves. And then now we have percutaneous valves as an emerging process, which is becoming disruptive to even minimally invasive valve surgery. And I'm sure all of you can think of other examples of this. I think the danger for surgeons in this, of course, is you can get disrupted right out of your own field. So surgeons have to stay flexible because if you don't do percutaneous or image-guided procedures, suddenly you can find yourself without any patients in that realm, and they'll go to another practitioner who does practice that kind of more minimally invasive procedure. So disruptive innovation is fun, it's interesting, it's good for patients, but it can take surgery right out of the surgeon's hands. So I think one of the challenges that we're at right now is disruptive innovation is happening at an increasingly rapid rate, and surgeons need to be aware of this and be flexible and be willing to re-educate themselves and relearn new approaches, or they can find themselves without cases to do. So there's a true danger, I think, that incremental innovation, as stated here, will not be fast enough for the marketplace, or on the other hand, that disruptive innovation, if surgeons aren't quick on their feet and willing to re-educate, can make surgery go away. And I think surgery is actually, there's a possibility it could be eliminated to a great extent by some of this disruptive innovation. And that sounds a little bit radical, but if you kind of look at the trend of surgery and think of the operations, 20 years ago, surgeons did far more operations than they do today, and the number of operations, the spectrum of surgery that we do, not just the volume, is going down at a fairly rapid rate. And this can have drastic shifts. If you look at vascular surgery, once again, as a good example of that, much of vascular surgery has gone to interventional techniques, and this is starting to happen in minimally invasive surgery. And I think certainly in my field of GI surgery, this is well as illustrated by the migration of operations to endoscopy. And I think back 20 years ago at what common procedures I used to do in my early practice, and this whole list of surgeries has essentially been eliminated because these are now commonly done as flexible endoscopic surgeries. Fortunately, I do flexible endoscopy and enjoy it, so I haven't totally lost access to all these. But if you didn't do flexible endoscopy, you could cross this fairly large, impressive list of procedures off your roster of the operating list. So just an illustration of how disruptive innovation needs to be paid attention to by surgeons, or we simply won't have anything to do in the future. So with that, that's kind of my introduction and definition of innovation as I see it. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Adrian to introduce our second speaker in this session.
Thanks, Lee. And we've had another couple of centers join Geisinger Clinic and Imperial College in London. And we'll once again just encourage folks as the presentation progresses. Questions or comments, let the folks at Course Call know so that I can pull you up. It's a real pleasure to introduce now Dr. Toby Gordon. Toby is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business, and Toby's expertise and really much of her life work has been in around the study of the science and the business of innovation. So she brings to us that perspective. Welcome, Toby.
Adrian, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk today about some business school perspectives on innovation in surgery to try and help give you some different perspectives on what's involved to actually bring innovations into use. There's a large funnel of a lot of great ideas, but really only a few ultimately make it into practice. So I'm going to talk about what some of those reasons are and some of the business foundations and challenges. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is that for a great idea to be successful as an innovation, the most important thing is that it has to solve a problem. We see a lot of ideas that might be very interesting innovations, but if they don't fundamentally solve a problem and improve how surgery is performed and care is delivered, there's not likely to be a great market for that innovation. Most innovations that we see relate to something else that's going on. I call that a platform or a foundation, something new that adds to what's already available in minimally invasive surgery. The minimally invasive surgery would be the example of the platform or the foundation. The idea has to be more than an idea. It has to be reduced to practice. You need a working prototype and ways to test and work with that innovation before it's ultimately going to be put into wide use and deemed successful. It's rare that you would have an innovation without a significant investment of resources. Even developing a new procedure that might not be capital intensive is still going to require a lot of time to actually develop that procedure. So resources are always required. We like to say that you have to have a business model. A business model means that you know that there are customers who will pay for your innovation and that the revenues that you can generate, even if it's not intended to be a significantly profitable activity, but just something you want to get into widespread use, you still have to have revenue that will cover your costs of R&D, your costs of sales, manufacturing, etc. So you have to have a viable business model. Over time, for your innovation to be successful, you have to be able to measure the effects. You know, what are the baseline measures? What outcomes were you looking for? Positive outcomes, negative outcomes. You have to be able to do outcomes analysis of new innovations. Ultimately, for an innovation to be successful, you would expect it to be widely adopted and sort of universally used. And I differentiate that from successful implementation. To me, successful implementation means that it's smoothly put into use without major technical issues or unanticipated consequences from implementing your innovation. And then I also like to see that the innovation can continue to be improved upon, and it may ultimately be disrupted by another innovation, but you'd like to see it improved upon rather than ultimately rejected for not having a value. And then last, a really successful innovation could have far-reaching implications in other fields beyond the field in which it was developed. So I'm going to go through a few examples to try and illustrate some of these points. So being from Hopkins, we always want to make sure we talk about William Stewart Halsted, and I think that his contributions to surgery make a great example for thinking about innovations. If you look back to the mid-19th century, we like to think of three major innovations: anesthesia, antisepsis, and control of bleeding, that totally revolutionized surgery and thus allowed much more invasive and complex surgery to be done, abdominal surgery, procedures that just couldn't be done before. And I like to think that this revolution in surgery is really what ushered in the modern hospital era, because there was now a reason to receive care in a hospital because you had to go there for this new type of surgical care that was available. And then through Halsted's work from 1889, or 1886 actually, until his death in 1922, developed, is known for many great innovations, but I think one that he's most known for is safe surgery, slower, careful surgery, and many new procedures that he developed and that were developed from his contributions. And then that, of course, laid the foundation for all the new surgical procedures, and ultimately everything we know about the world of surgery today evolved out of this trajectory of innovations starting back in the mid-19th century. So another thing we can learn from this example is that decades of work often precede and then follow innovations before their value is both realized and appreciated. So as we just looked at the Halsted safe surgery example, much work went before Halsted's principles, and then it took time for it to be widely disseminated and accepted. Some other examples of really major innovations that were turning points in surgery, again, work before and then the time period afterwards that could be 10 to 20 years for the innovations to be put into practice. So trauma and critical care systems that have come out of each war, we've learned new things. Bypass surgery, transplantation, minimally invasive surgery. Again, much work leading up to the innovations being put into place, and then continual expansion of the use and effectiveness of these innovations. We also know, though, that many innovators, and probably especially disruptive innovators, have to endure a lot of criticism and face a lot of adversity. And this is part of why there are many ideas, but the funnel, only few sort of make it through. And if you look back in medical history, Pasteur was laughed at. People didn't believe the germ theory. The same thing happened with Semmelweis and the idea of hand washing. And then for those of you that are familiar with Codman's work on essentially outcomes research and tracking surgical outcomes in 1910, my understanding is he was more or less forced out of MGH and laughed at for his idea that outcomes would be tracked, which of course we all know where that stands now. And there are also barriers to innovations, particularly in innovative academic medical centers, what is commonly called as the not invented here syndrome. So there are many things that innovators have to do to get their invention or their innovation into practice. And there's just a little quote here about something that was said to Pasteur that people just didn't believe it, and you see many examples of this type of early opposition to innovations that ultimately were big game changers. My favorite example, though, of this, it's probably apocryphal, but sort of taken as true. So you can see on the left, that large picture is the Halsted All-Star operation at Hopkins. And the photo on the top right, Charles Mayo, and this quote's been attributed to both of the Mayo brothers, but the gist of it is, watching Halsted operate was the first time I ever saw the upper half of an incision heal before the lower end was closed. So, Halsted, even though we can all now look back and say safe surgery was one of his great contributions, he was kind of ridiculed in many ways for that. So to some extent, we can learn a lot about measuring the impact of innovation from looking at all that happened with the work that Halstead did. And the first thing is we can really only study the effect of innovations retroactively. We have to look back and really see what happened and see what happened in that body of work. And you have to really consider long-term outcomes. You know, things can look great, but the test of time is always critical. And just parenthetically, the recent media coverage of Da Vinci robots is a good example of how long-term outcomes, you know, you get a different perspective with time and experience that you just don't always know right in the beginning when the innovation hits the market. And it could take 10 to 20 years to see the full impact of an innovation. Now, this graph on the bottom shows what the typical curve of technology adoption is. And you start with early innovators, early adopters, and so on through this graph that's, you know, pretty much been demonstrated in different fields that this is the curve that's followed. And the way you can, the x-axis, the time dimensions can vary from a really long time from the innovators until the laggards adopt the innovation, or it could happen very rapidly. In computer chips, it happens pretty quickly. When cell phones first came out, and probably even today, there's still laggards who have their rotary phones and don't want to get rid of them. So the time frame for implementing the innovation depends on how quickly this curve is followed. And most people, when I ask, think that this curve was mathematically derived from work with cell phones or recent technology, but this curve actually came from work done in the 1960s looking at the willingness of farmers to use hybrid seed corn in Iowa. So this is a phenomenon that's been shown over a long period of time. And it's always important with an innovation to realize that there's just going to be some time before everybody gets on board with the innovation. And the more widely it's used, that's part of studying the impact. Okay. So when we think about the timeline to success for an innovation, so I've defined innovations in the medical arena: drugs, devices, procedures, and processes. And on the left, the drug development pipeline and implementation and so on is a very long trajectory, 8 to 12 years. It just takes a really long time to bring new drugs to market, and then a little more time beyond that before they're put into widespread use. Devices, the time frame can be shorter, mostly because what makes the drug process take so long is the FDA processes and clinical trials. Devices, there's many mechanisms, as you know, to accelerate bringing them to market. The newer the device, the more complicated, the more it's a combination device, it's going to take longer. Procedures, because they generally are not subject to the same type of testing, could be implemented in a shorter, time frame. And then new processes like timeouts, hand washing, again, those could potentially be implemented more quickly because they don't have all of the same regulatory burdens. Okay, so the next thing is that we know that innovations require investment of time and resources, and I talked about that earlier as one of the requirements. And when you think about what those things are, of course, there's the whole R&D part. Prototyping is critical in the early stages. Intellectual property protection, most people who innovate, if want to come up with some way to protect the intellectual property, at least to recover the investment costs that were put into it. A new procedure may not have that same need for intellectual property protection or ability to actually generate revenue. Regulatory approval processes can be very costly and add to the time frame. And then there's the whole process of getting coverage coding and reimbursement, which again, costly legal consulting fees, etc. And then just the manufacturing costs and sales and marketing. So going from an idea to actually having your innovation in the market has many steps that for a new drug could be $1 billion. For a device, it's going to depend on, I think the key factor is the cost of testing in clinical trials. Next slide, please.
Toby, can I interrupt just one sec?
Yeah, I know you want me to go faster. Okay.
No, but we've got a question from Mount Sinai, and we'll go briefly to Sinai, a question on some of the stuff that Toby's just talked about.
Adrian, it's Barry Salke.
Hey, Barry, welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm surrounded in this room by, I don't know, 10, 12 young surgeons in training, some of them almost finished, some of them starting. And I'm looking at, listening to this presentation, and I'm seeing that, and these people are, as most of the residents sitting around you, very bright, lots of ideas, very interested in the future of what's going to be happening to them. For me, it's mainly over, but for them, it's starting. So, and I'm listening to the presentation about how you come up with an idea, and how they push that forward. It's pretty clear to me that it's really, while the surgeon's going to have the idea, a business person of some sort is the one who's going to get pitched with this idea. So the decision-making process of this idea or innovation going forward is really going to have some stop blocks that are going to be put up by the business people, not so much the innovator. So how does Dr. Gordon or Lee see younger people being able to actually put their ideas forward and really have the potential of making an impact in this? It's not so simple. I mean, it's just not so simple. The resources that are required are huge, and how do they do that?
Expressing the sense, I think, of growing helplessness of many of us. Toby, back to you.
Yeah. So I think it is reality that you need resources. I think the big companies are not going around looking for very early stage discoveries that are maybe still in that idea or prototype phase. So I think that if you're in a university, the first thing you want to do is try and get non-dilutive capital, either NIH funding, SBIRs, sweat equity, work with your tech transfer office. You can do all sorts of licensing deals where you might get people who work with early stage companies to invest. But you're going to have to take your innovation through each step, and then at each step you might bring more funding. It's a sort of a sequential process. So I think it's really critical that, as you pointed out, surgeons need to work with engineers and people in business, and it's going to take a team approach. And what the gap we're trying to bridge is that clinical folks don't know the business side folks don't always know the clinical side. So we need more people working together, and more people who can be what I call the boundary spanners, who can kind of talk both languages. So MD PhDs in biomedical engineering are learning all about innovation and entrepreneurship. So I think there's going to be a new skill set for both the development and for the outcomes assessment. And I think an organization that wants to focus on innovation needs to be able to offer the full spectrum of the business thinking, the outcomes evaluation, the prototyping, industry partnerships, all the things that we know there are barriers to in academia. We have to remove those barriers and find ways to get multiple disciplines, and industry not being such a terrible thing. There are ways to work with industry as well. But I think breaking the process down into steps, and probably the most important thing, because I look at ideas and innovations all the time, is that you get something and it's like, wow, this is great, and then you go do a patent landscape search and there's 1,000 other variations of the same thing. So you want to focus on a problem that needs to be solved, where there's a truly differentiated new product, and then you have to go from there.
So Toby, why don't you go to your slide that says some final words, because I think that encapsulates nicely what you're talking about.
Okay, so that is, it just says some final words on the top?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, so I think, to the point I was trying to make, there are a lot of barriers in academia to partnering with industry. So I think we want to push the residents and the medical students and the young faculty to be innovating and finding people to work with. We need the senior leadership to help remove barriers to innovating so that you can work with industry. There are ways to do it. Even with potential conflicts of interest, they can be managed and disclosed. So that's a huge thing that has to be worked on. I think right now we're in this kind of backlash period with fear about working with industry, and that has to be addressed. I think the other thing that people need to be aware of now is that this period we were in where innovations were profitable and looked for and rewarded, that's kind of the hallmark of American medicine in many ways. But now all the incentives under healthcare reform are oriented towards lower cost care and ambulatory settings and primary care, and innovations are going to have to be huge game changers to really be invested in and brought into practice. And in the accountable care thinking and legislation, they expect accountable care organizations to drive down the use of technology through the incentives that were built in. And on top of that, there's now a tax that the medical manufacturers have to pay, which is taking a huge chunk out of their bottom lines. So, and then last, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny of new technologies with comparative effectiveness research. So on the policy side, there's a lot that's in place because technology and innovation is viewed as the big cost drivers. And we need people to see where it can make a significant improvement in cost effectiveness. And we need surgeons, we need people studying outcomes research and business and knowing how to bring these things into practice. That's it on my final words.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Toby, and hang around because we're going to have the questions and comments to come back to you. But I do want to just go around for a question for a minute. Let's go to Carolina's Medical Center. And the question I have for the folks there, we tend to talk about technology and devices in terms of, and we're going to hear a bit more about regulatory requirements. But can we think about procedures? Should procedures be seen not just as innovations, clearly we can talk about them that way, but as protectable or requiring regulatory approval? Not just devices, but are we gonna be looking at having to for the same kind of burden of proof for new procedures, do we think? Welcome, Todd and Demetra.
Adrian, good morning. I think that the procedures, I think we vet procedures a lot better than we vet technologies. I think that surgeons actually, given the once-over to procedures and looking at it in the literature, performing prospective studies and looking at patient outcomes, we can vet these pretty quickly. I don't think they should be protected. I think that as far as procedures go, that we should share them. I think technologies and the investment in technologies is much greater. The financial investment, the time investment, and those things, they need to be protected. I do have two questions, one for Dr. Swanstrom and one for Dr. Gordon. And for Lee, my question would be is, we're training surgeons, we don't know what's going to happen in 6 to 8 years. And we're training surgeons who are going to retire in 2045. I mean, how do we tell them where to make their personal investment, their time, their investment in these new technologies? When do they push their chips in and say, I'm going to spend the time and the effort to learn this? The next question would be for Dr. Gordon. Given the changes at the FDA, which they seem to be ever-changing, the rules seem to be ever-changing and ill-defined, and I think that the throughput of technology may actually slow, or the investment in new technology, because the rules are changing and the chance of getting something through the FDA is unknown. Do you see that actually technology will slow because of that? And I will look forward to your answers, and thank you very much for your conversation this morning.
Can I also make a comment? Adrian, to address your question, I think it is important to protect patients during implementation of innovation. There's no question. And we all know that there's a learning curve associated with anything new we do, and we do see the consequences of that learning curve. We've seen this before with the introduction of laparoscopy. So I do think that if we are responsible for what we do, we need to do I'm all for innovation, but we need to do this safely, and sometimes there's a very fine line that determines this. SAGES is currently trying to address this issue, trying to come up, through the guidelines committee, we're trying to come up with maybe a better way of doing this, but I'm not sure that there's a perfect answer to the question.
Well, thank you both for those questions and comments. Toby, a quick response, and then we'll head back to Lee.
Sure. So I think everybody is concerned and worried about the FDA and the processes. We're physically not that far from the FDA, so when we interact with our colleagues there, they want to help. They want people to come and talk to them and get help navigating the process. It's hard, and they do have satellite offices, but so they will help you, and I think they're pretty aware of this. But I think the bigger thing that's happening, and I think this gets at your question about the people who are being trained for 2045, is that there's still so much unmet need in surgery, and there's so much need globally, and there's this globalization going on in terms of needing many more lower-cost innovations, not just in emerging markets, but in the U.S. So on the one hand, finding, the newest, kind of more, say, esoteric screw for an orthopedic procedure and getting it through the FDA. I'm making this example up. There will, I don't know how much faster that process can get, but I think there are still many opportunities to try and move big game-changing things through, and I think that's the pressure that will be brought to bear on the FDA, and that what the advice I would give to people training is to think beyond the United States and think about innovations in a different light in terms of access, quality, cost savings. Because I think up to now we've looked at kind of the really high-end technologies, but we have to look at the rest of the pyramid of innovation, I think.
That's great. That's a great segue Lee, back to you now.
Yeah, just to address Todd's comment, which I think is a really good comment about how we prep surgeons today to be flexible enough to adapt these disruptive innovations. I think that's probably one of the benefits of subspecialization in training, which of course is a controversial thing, but I think there's a couple elements. One is that traditionally medical education has relied on tradition and honoring tradition, and that's made it a very slow changing thing. It's kind of nice and really makes us feel like a part of a craft or part of a métier, if you will. But I think we need to change that, and we need to start training our trainees to be flexible and to look at innovation and to look outside their own field, because disruptive innovation may come from imaging, may come from chemistry, it may be something else. So we should start teaching people now to be flexible and look outside their field. I think if you're invested in your disease process, if you find a subspecialization that makes you more open to addressing that with whichever tool that you can come up with. I think if you just hand a resident a set of tools, say, here's a new technology, that they're a little bit at a loss of what to do with it. On the other hand, if you say, here's your disease that you like, that you know everything about, that you want to take care of, and feel free to borrow from other disciplines to treat that in the best way possible, that they're probably going to be more flexible thinking in looking at that. But it's a good question. It's hard. How do we teach innovations? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes. Do you want me to go ahead and proceed on, Adrian?
Yeah, please do.
So why don't we go back to my slides, if you will. So Adrian had initially approached Toby and I about a top 10 in innovation. So I kind of tried to reformat things that we were talking about into two things. One is opportunities, and the other one is threats. It's always more fun to talk about threats than it is opportunities. So So I divided our top 10 into two sections. One is threats and the other one's opportunities. And this may be a good thing to open for more comments and there. But as Toby already outlined, there's a lot of threats to surgical innovation right now. In 2013, all health systems all over the world are out of money. So cost is becoming a big issue. Surgeons less and less have any control over new technology, the introduction into the health system, and that control is being progressively taken out of our hands. I think there's definitely a perception that new surgical technology is an add-on cost, and just that it's a liability to innovate and to bring new things in. I think right now there's definitely a lack of interest in investment in new surgical technologies, partly because of all this regulation and healthcare changes. And then the FDA, if you ask industry what the biggest problem, biggest threat, if you will, to surgical innovation is, in spite of kind of the friendly face the FDA puts on, industry will certainly tell you that the FDA process is the major threat that they have. So, I think we all know about the monetary crisis. Healthcare is gobbling up the national product of all countries, particularly in the United States, and technology is certainly identified as one of the major problems with that, and not always fairly, I think. So, from my perception and from others, although this isn't the official word, it really seems like the FDA has put the brakes on approval of new medical devices. It certainly has become a bottleneck, and just some data to support that. And this is in the face of, the official word is that there is no brakes, that the United States is still friendly to innovation and friendly to new technology. President Obama has actually come out and said that we need to innovate, we need to introduce new technology. As you can see from his quote here, being like an airplane without an engine, so we need to do it. But if you look at the trend of approvals for new medical devices, you'll see a definite downward trend, whichever approval track is there, whether it's 510K or PMAs. There are fewer and fewer being granted every year. And this is really getting throttled down progressively, and this slide ends at 2010. I can tell you the last 2 years have been even more dramatic of a decrease in approvals. And I think this is threatened even more. Obviously, industry and surgeons like the 510K process. If you're not aware of that, that's a predicate pathway to approving new things. So you can take a device and get it through the FDA if it's a lot like a pre-existing device that's already used and been approved. So it's kind of an expedited pathway to get through, but the FDA is seriously considering eliminating the 510K pathway. And you have to say, this is based on devices from 30 years ago, and they do kind of stretch that out, but so, I think this is a process that could certainly be redone, but if they eliminated it, it could be a big problem. This just shows why that's important. This kind of shows a comparison between 510K process pathways and the European equivalent, which is a CE mark. And you can see here that on the FDA's web page, how long it takes something to get through a 510K process. They say 3 months as the average total eclipse time. In reality, it's much longer than that. 31 months is kind of the average from first communication to clearance. So there's a tremendous lag between actuality and the statement. And you compare this to the European system, CE, it's 7 months. Still a long time, over half a year, but much shorter than what's actually happening in the FDA. And this is a big problem for companies. And as we migrate towards a PMA process and look at that, once again on the FDA website, it says a PMA approval process takes about 9 months, almost a year. But actually, if you look at actual data of how long it takes, 54 months. So almost 5 years to get through a PMA process, which of course, a PMA process, for those that don't know, requires laboratory evidence of efficacy and safety. So you have to do animal studies, you have to do human studies. It's very expensive and very time-consuming to do. Once again, you look at the European system that I'm having increasing experience, and it's not all that smooth either, but it's still less than a year on average to getting a CE certificate, kind of an equivalent of a PMA process. So this is important for industry because these are extremely expensive processes. There's a recent report of medical device development in the U.S. estimates an average of $24 million for each successful FDA 510K submission. $24 million, and that's for the expedited process. $94 million as an average for a PMA process. So this is just overwhelming for a startup company, and this has really squashed the desire for medical device development, especially if it's some small device. And Barry Sulkey was involved in a trocar closure device, and it's just the cost of bringing something like that to market is just overwhelming. And this has kind of resulted in a total disinterest now in investment because it's so expensive and so time-consuming for the investment community, major investment banks or venture capitalists or even angel funders to get involved in medical devices. So there's been a 70% decrease in the funding of medical device companies over the last 5 years, just plummeting that because nobody's willing to invest $1 million in a new device, especially if it's going to take 5 years before it can even get to the market. It just doesn't pencil out from a business standpoint. So new medical device company startups are the lowest since 1996 and continues to go down. Venture funding is plummeting in medical technology device, and this is just a big problem for surgeons. We're not going to, the pipeline for new technologies for us to do a better job in surgery is just drying up and going away. And as Toby mentioned, the medical device tax is just like kicking the cripple on the street corner when they're down. This is really going to hurt, and it's estimated, it's kind of a fine print slide, but this is the economic impact of on medical technology industry estimated, and this is, I have to say, this is a little bit biased because it comes from medical technology, but they're estimating that if this medical tax is implemented, which is was due to go in at the beginning of this year, has been postponed, and hopefully Congress will revoke it, it's going to hurt the economy a great deal because it will even further squelch introduction of new companies, employment, etc. there. So $8 billion there. In fact, it's estimated that if they do implement this new tax, it'll actually cost, for every dollar of income that's made from the medical device tax, it'll actually cost the economy $1.6. So kind of a slippery slope. You know, I think the end result of this, all of us have noticed, is that there's a flight of technology from the United States because this is the United States is the most critical. This is happening to some extent in a lot of places, but in the United States it's become very, very bad, and because of that, all startup companies are leaving the United States and going offshore to at least do their first human use things, to get their initial approval, CE marks, or taking it to South America, and just a huge flight of industry in the medical technology industry out of the United States. And these other countries are recognizing this and making a soft landing, if you will, for these companies, and are really sucking it dry. So for North America, this is really a tragic and bad thing. So I'm a little bit concerned. I think one of the biggest threats is that there's a growing attitude in regulation, and you see this in your hospital, that new things are being looked at as a negative or just more trouble than they're worth, a big cost. And I think surgeons really need to work and educate people that technology doesn't have to be an add-on cost, that it is important, that it keeps medicine alive and keeps it progressing, and that really to take better care of patients, we need to continue to promote new things there, and we can't have this phobia against introducing new things. So I don't know, Adrienne, do you want to see if anybody has comments about that?
Well, as we're running down to the last 5 minutes, I'd say if we've got questions or comments, please call in, and but if you just continually, I'll interrupt with questions that we get come in.
Okay. So maybe just not to end on a negative note, can we have the next slide? So I think there are things. There's definitely some threats to technology, but there's certainly opportunities. I think if you like, surgeons tend to like gizmos, and certainly as surgery becomes increasingly technology driven, it's a great opportunity for new devices. I think it's good surgeons are flexible in their mind, and our trainees can be trained to adapt to new paradigms. It's we're trying to get to people interested in flexible endoscopy, and our residents are thriving on that. I think we need to prove, and I think it's provable, that new surgical technologies can actually save money and result in better patient care and more expedited care. And I think laparoscopy is one of the great triumphs that have shown that. If you think of the cumulative amount of money that laparoscopic surgery has saved the country and getting patients out of the hospital days sooner, it's great for an individual patient, but if you add that up to the hundreds of thousands of surgeries that are done every day, this is a huge benefit to society, and the amount of money that's saved from that really needs to be trumpeted. And I think there's new paradigms of innovations beyond gadgets, and Toby touched on that, and we really need to start promoting that, different, not just new tricks and things. So I think surgeons really need to start looking at new models for innovation, and once again, Toby kind of mentioned this. It's been a fun era of coming up with new gadgets, and the Da Vinci robots perhaps the crowning achievement of gadget-oriented things of fun and amusing to do, but very expensive. But I think we need to start looking at innovations along value-based things, that maybe surgical innovations should look at ways to slow healthcare spending and invest in this. And I think this is a great field, and that we should encourage this. And Ara Darzi, I don't know if Imperial's online, but Ara Darzi published this very interesting paper. In fact, he started a global health economics program that's very specifically looking at this, the role surgeons can have in reducing medical costs by early interventions and innovative treatment for diseases. So I think one of the things we can do, and this is just kind of a partial list I have, and partly from his publication, of room for innovations that we can do beyond surgical devices, improving training and transfer of knowledge, simulation, operating room efficiencies, environmental concerns. I think one of the big interests in notes surgery was the possibility of moving surgeries out of the hospital and out of sterile environments, and eliminating that expensive environment. I'm very interested in fusion therapies, of drawing from other fields, as I mentioned, chemistry or radiology, interventional radiology, to start using some of their tools and looking at those. And I think as we can benefit more and more people by reducing the impact society-wise, getting people back to work in 2 or 3 days instead of 2 or 3 weeks, and tracking that impact on society, and surgeons really need to take claim on the amount of money that things like that save.
Yeah, Lee, we're going to have to wrap up in a sec here.
Yeah, so just my concluding thing is that, I think this kind of new spirit of innovation is teachable. and that surgeons need to start training our residents to be innovators, but innovators in a new way. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Lee and Toby, and I think that I hope that the audience appreciates that there's opportunity where there's challenge, and certainly we're facing a time of great challenge in terms of innovation. I think, like many of these programs, this has provided some food for thought and maybe discussion in surgeons' lounges as we go forward. I do want to thank, we do have to curtail the discussion now. I do want to thank so very much Lee for that presentation and for getting up so early, for Toby Gordon for very thoughtful input and from the business perspective. Thank you so much. Our next month's topic, June 7th, will be innovation. Will be on the subject BMI less than 35. How low can you go? Phil Schauer will be moderating that from Cleveland Clinic, Maine. Once again, I thank the audience for attending today and the participation we had, and a final thank you to Dr. Swanstrom and Gordon. Thanks very much, and have a good day.
Thanks, Adrian.